Hello, and welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm Eli Bieker. Guns in America outnumber everyday citizens. If you look at the data and do the math, for every 100 people, there are 115 privately owned guns, or maybe more, depending on estimations. They permeate our culture and society, and a new course at St. Thomas, Guns in American History, explores the arc of the Second Amendment, its origins, how it's changed, and how Americans have exercised this right throughout history. Today, I'm joined by Professor Jennifer McCutchen, historian and instructor of this new class. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Professor McCutchen, could you tell me a little bit about your background and what led you into creating this course?
Sure. So my research really focuses on gunpowder and the trade of gunpowder in the colonial and revolutionary eras to Native peoples. And I really take what I call an ethno-historical approach to gunpowder. So I look at how gunpowder impacts culture, impacts cultural adaptation, adjustment, more so than looking at the nuts and bolts of how much gunpowder was traded, quantities, all of that stuff. So that has gotten me really interested in the development of gun culture in early America and how that impacts gun culture in our nation today. It's also provided opportunities for me to do some public-facing work as an expert witness for Second Amendment cases, where I write reports, essentially, called declarations for state-level Second Amendment cases when states are being sued by either private organizations or citizens regarding gun restrictions. So those two things together have kind of piqued my interest in teaching a course on guns in American history at St. Thomas. And so I proposed the course last year, got it approved, and this is the first semester that I'm able to teach it.
Amazing. You talked a little bit about your work kind of within the legal world as an expert witness. Can you talk a little bit more about that and about the interconnectedness of history with law and politics?
Yeah, so in 2022, there was a case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, and that was a Second Amendment case where the state of New York was being sued by a couple of private citizens over their gun laws regarding concealed carry permits. And basically, at the time, the state of New York had the ability to restrict or revoke concealed carry purposes based on very subjective decision making. And so as a result of that case, legal scholars and lawmakers now look to historical precedent in order to decide Second Amendment cases. So they contract historians like me to look and see if there are arguments to be made for either gun restrictions or a loosening of gun restrictions based on previous laws extending all the way back to not only the colonial era but English common law. And so we see really this intersection of history and legal studies and current Second Amendment law coming from this Bruin case and now the historical precedent approach that is being employed in Second Amendment cases all over the country.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing. I want to dive a little bit into the class material itself, and I think we're better to start than the origins. The Second Amendment protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and also mentions a well-regulated militia. So what historical circumstances gave rise to that and that kind of phrasing?
Yeah, that's a great question. At this time, the Second Amendment is ratified in 1791, and the United States was a new nation that had just fought for its independence against what they believed to be a very tyrannical governing force, a monarchy, a king, and a parliament that had, committed a number of grievances against the colonists and singled them out, not as to be treated as equal subjects in the empire. So one of the main fears that the Second Amendment aimed to protect the people against was a tyrannical government. And so the idea, especially the wording, like you mentioned, of a militia and the right to bear arms, was really so that the American people could come together collectively against larger political forces of tyranny, whether that is a tyrannical leader, a tyrannical government, or a standing army. There is a significant fear of a standing army. So in 1791, the motivation for something like the Second Amendment was for collective ability to push back against these tyrannical governing forces and ensure that at the local level, people and communities could engage civically and be civically minded in a way that could allow them to come together and use these weapons as tools to push back against threats to their autonomy and independence.
Looking kind of towards today, the right to bear arms is such a significant pillar to the American identity. Where does this stem from, and has this always been the case?
Yeah, it has not always been the case. If we look at the ratification in 1791 and then early interpretations and iterations of the Second Amendment, this idea of individual right to bear arms is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. It was very much a collectively minded amendment and outline of rights until probably the 20th century. And then we get a number of shifts related to crime, related to an increased influx of weapons among the American people after World War II. And we see a shift in culture where people are starting to feel like perhaps the structures that are put in place are not able to protect me in a way that I feel I need to be protected, and I need to take matters into my own hands and be able to protect myself. And part of that too has to do with shifts in marketing, a move away from marketing guns as tools for sport and sporting related activities like hunting, and a push toward marketing of you need a gun to protect yourself and your family from violent crime. And so you have these two things kind of feeding into one another that really pushes this argument in the second half of the 20th century and through today that guns are necessary for individual protection and not collective protection.
Kind of on that realm, looking to today, locally, within the last year, Minnesota has witnessed heartbreaking gun violence that kind of relates to this conversation, including the death of the Hortmans and the attack on the Hoffmans family, as well as the shooting at Annunciation Catholic Church. And so when these events happen, the conversation around the Second Amendment rears its head collectively. You've talked about how this amendment and the way it's exercised shifts throughout time. How do we approach and how do we talk about a 250-year-old law in the 21st century?
Context is incredibly important. Thinking about the context in which the Second Amendment was created in 1791, these fears of governmental tyranny, these fears of losing your collective autonomy, and the threat that a tyrannical or overpowering government could have is incredibly important for understanding the context in which the Second Amendment was created, as well as the types of weapons that were in circulation during the time that the Second Amendment was created. We're talking about rifles being cutting-edge technology in 1791. In 1791, most Americans had muzzle-loading firearms, muskets, that if you were very good at firing, you could maybe fire one shot per minute, but it probably wasn't going to be terribly accurate. And so context is very important for understanding in less than 250 years, how do we need to kind of come to the table and interpret these laws regarding guns differently, and thinking about ways of regulating this in order to respond to the gun violence that you've described.
On the topic of regulation, last month Governor Walz announced a, quote, what he called a comprehensive gun violence prevention package, which includes a ban on military-style assault rifles, implementing a firearm insurance requirement, and creating and expanding early intervention resources. So if this were to pass, in your class you talk about the arc of the Second Amendment, how would this shift the story of guns in America?
I think focusing on regulation is a big part of this, and not an outright ban of all weapons, and not something that would really undermine the Second Amendment for the individual, but thinking about regulation and also regulating through insurance. One of the things that we will discuss in my class toward the end of the semester is a push in line with what Governor Walz is saying in this bill to regulate firearms as consumer products. The Consumer Product Safety Commission currently does not regulate firearms, even though they are a consumer product on the market. And so how can we get insurance companies on board with regulating guns as consumer products, and how would that impact or change access and affordability of guns, and also allow for regulation to be more comprehensive.
Beyond government regulation, your students are also addressing the conversation around guns and gun violence through community engagement. Can you tell me a little bit about this part of the course?
Yeah, so we're very excited about this. We're collaborating with the Center for the Common Good. We have invited Billy Moore to campus to speak to us in April. Billy was convicted of a gun-related murder in 1984 in Chicago, and he now works as a gun violence interventionist in Chicago and speaks all around the country. And really our conversation is going to be centered around violence and justice, gun violence and justice. So how does gun violence impact our communities? How does it impact the community of St. Paul? How are people directly affected by gun violence? And perhaps how could regulations or deeper conversations about these tensions really allow us as civically engaged members of our communities to think differently and think critically about the ways in which gun violence affect our everyday lives?
On that last note, could you tell me a little bit more about, like, I suppose, responsibility as students and academics and people that are having conversations about this and having an engagement with the larger community? Why is that important?
I think it's important for a number of reasons. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about guns and gun owners in the United States. There's two very disparate sides of the spectrum. You have people who feel like gun owners are irresponsible and need to take more responsibility and have more regulations. And then you have others who feel like this is an individual right that is codified in the Constitution, and that gun owners should be able to, use and operate and access guns as they see fit. And so I think what I want my students to understand after taking this class is that it's a lot more complicated than that. The ways in which people think about their relationship to guns, not only as citizens of the United States, but also as global citizens, I think is something that I want my students to grapple with. And then also how that affects us at the local level. How can you affect change in your community, or how can you uphold your own belief systems about a certain topic by thinking critically about it and engaging in dialogue and debate with other students in your class and people in the community, including Billy Moore, who's going to come to campus with us.
On the topic of dialogue and debate, I wanted to bring up a point here. According to a 2024 Pew Research study, gun policy was among one of the most important aspects for voters in the last presidential election, above things like abortion, climate change, and racial inequality. So clearly there's vested interest in kind of tackling this topic, but with so many different opinions on what good gun policy is between individuals and parties, addressing issues can be a challenge in legislation. So for us as individuals, how can we have conversations? How can we approach these topics that are so divisive?
I think I always go back to empathy as a professor of this class or a professor of any of my classes here at St. Thomas. Thinking about things critically, hearing what people have to say about their own lived experience, and then developing empathy for that, I think are really important. And I think when we talk about legislation and we talk about how these discussions can impact future legislation, thinking about also how gun violence is not an abstract thing. It is something that has deeply affected our community here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and probably if we walked around campus and talked to most of the people around us, most of them would say that they have in some way been in proximity to or directly affected by gun violence. And so I think encouraging students to engage openly in conversations, to have those hard conversations that are sometimes difficult to have, and to try to develop empathy and understanding for people who are different than them, to understand that everybody's lived experience is different and everybody has gotten here through different paths. It humanizes, and it allows us to really see that the legislation that we decide to vote for or not vote for is going to really shape our communities.
Well, thank you so much for your insight, and thank you for sharing. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Follow along at thecrest.news and follow us on social media at The Crest News for more stories from your campus community. With Jennifer McCutchen, I'm Eli Bieker. We'll see you next time we deep dive.